when was you mentioned that your grandfather was in the car business. What decade would he have?
So we ran the business basically from 1920 to about 1990.
Wow, I started in 20.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's jump ahead a little bit and start talking about the 60s, 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that awful, the riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated. What you remember from how old you were.
Yeah, I was at that point in time in 8th grade. And King, many of you will remember, was assassinated on a Thursday. Actually, a Thursday before the following Thursday was Holy Thursday, leading into the Easter holiday. So in the framework of early April. And so assassinated on Thursday, the nation starts to try to absorb this, react to it or whatever. So Saturday evening, my parents had friends that they would routinely every other month, they'd either come to our place in Joliet or we'd go to their home in Palos. So they were down, it was the month to be in Joliet. And so the routine was the parents would play cards after they put all the kids to bed, usually order a pizza from Pizza Box, which is still in business down the street from the campus. Linda's now called. Okay, it was a Pizza Box then. And then usually about midnight, toss the kids in the car and the one family would go home. So anyway, cards are going on, and I can remember sort of a commotion in the house along about 10 o'clock or whatever. And so, I mean, you didn't get out of your bed or leave your bedroom, but you opened your ears up. What are my parents talking about? And evidently riots had broken out on the south end of Joliet. And in the south end, right near, again on Chicago Street, but the light just before you get on the I-80 interchange, there was a Chrysler dealership there. The Saper family owned the dealership at the time. And so next to the dealership was an A&P grocery store. And the A&P grocery store had been set on fire as the crowds got unruly. Joliet sort of panicked. As I remember, the city raised the lift bridges to try to contain whatever was going on to the east side of the city. And then, of course, the city police force moved in and tried to quell the situation and obviously put out the fire and protect Saper's car dealership, which lots of new cars at the outlandish price in those days of probably $2,000 a car were sitting around there with these brand new stickers on them. So that was the Saturday fiasco. Sunday comes and, rest seemingly settles on the city again until we get to Sunday night. And actually right on the other side of the railroad tracks here, where a lot of that parking is at and some of the newer lots will go, part of the intermodal center, was a large warehouse where a number of the companies downtown stored furniture and some bigger durable goods in that building. Well, again, some unrest broke out. That building was burnt and went down to the ground. So at this point, the city decided they couldn't handle this on their own, and like Chicago and like many cities around the country, they called in the National Guard. So if you could imagine this, what happened starting Monday through the rest of the week, at 6 o'clock, everybody had to leave the downtown. All businesses had to close. There was a curfew, exactly. Shortly before that went into effect, the guard troop were deployed, and so you'd have sitting on corners scattered around the downtown area, people in a Jeep with the mounted machine gun on the back end, with the helmet on and the whole shot, almost like, where's the war and what time are things going to start? So, there were some protests that went on during the week, but there was nothing big, and it seemed like the Guard had controlled everything, caused people to settle down, and nothing was happening. So we come to Thursday night. And my dad was closing the business. We were in the spot where Silver Cross Field is. We had a 4-story building there, originally built as a Ford Farm implement building. So they sold tractors and all of those big types of things that you use for farming out of that building. And we had purchased it in '63, I think it was, and moved automobiles in there. And naturally, if it could hold tractors, it can hold cars. So we had the building there. During that week of unrest, what our drill was every evening, the 2 parking areas on each side of Jefferson Street, where cars park up against the railroad hill there, incline, those were our used car lots. So what we would do in the evening is, as we got ready to close, all the used cars would come into the building for fear that somebody go by and throw something through a windshield or whatever. And then all the customer cars were moved into the building. Again, remember, we've got 4 stories. I think you could store probably about 50, 60 cars on a floor, so you could get quite a few cars in that building. So all of it was put in. So my dad's locking the place at around 5:30 in the evening, and as he locks the front door and starts to walk to his car, he hears the phone ring, and he debates, do I go back and answer the phone, or do I leave? Is my wife calling to bring home a loaf of bread, or a gallon of milk? What's going on? And so he said he hesitated a bit going back, and decided he was just going to get in his car and leave. And during that time of hesitation, he heard something crash through, again, large panes of windows that showed your cars on the first floor in the showroom. He heard a pane of glass break. And so he didn't know what it was. He continued to move towards his car, and he looked back towards the building to see if something had happened in the building, and he noticed that flames had started in the middle of the showroom floor. And what had happened was a Molotov cocktail was thrown into the building. Well, if you can imagine a building loaded with cars that all have gasoline in the tanks. This building was built in, I think, the 30s or something. So all of the floors of the building were wood with steel beams holding the wood, and that wood was soaked with oil from the farm implements before, and then whatever residue had come off of cars. So needless to say, the building went up like a candle in terms of burning quickly. The fire department came, and really they could only try to contain the fire, because right next to us, our buildings adjoined, the next door was Polk Brothers, again, which was a chain that was in the Chicagoland area for years, and they were trying to protect as much of that building as they could, but needless to say, the place went up in smoke. But of course, because we're built with steel and brick, the walls and everything else are standing, even though the inside of the building sort of collapses as the wood gives way and the weight comes down. So the city asked for permission to take the building down that night. They were afraid that one of the walls would tip without full structural integrity. Can we bring in a crane and knock the building down immediately? So yeah, obviously you have to do that. And what we dealt with in the days after were, customers. My car was in there for service. What are you going to do about my car? Well, it's sitting out along the railroad tracks right now, those little smash things that you see there when all the rocks and bricks came down on it. It's probably one of those. You're welcome to take it. But we were dealing with loads of insurance claims on who's responsible for what. And of course, everything is complicated by, it wasn't just a fire, it was an intentional fire. And in light of that, the insurance companies were going, well, we don't know if we're going to be responsible for this, that, and the other. So needless to say, it was sort of a mess to wander through over the course of the next 6 to 9 months getting over that.
Mm-hmm. I remember you telling me that there were some members of the black community. Mm-hmm. You want to tell that story?
Yeah. My grandfather had several guys that worked for him that were African American, and members of the community came forward to my grandfather and my dad in the days after the fire, and they said, we want you to know, we didn't do this. They were troublemakers from outside. We had nothing to do with this. We can't believe they bothered your business. You were always so good to us. And so, I mean, again, you're sitting there going, well, I'm just dealing with a disaster here. But isn't it nice that people from the community, people that we thought we were friends with and we work with and whatever, come forward and say, you know, you might think it was us, but we had nothing to do with it. So, and that pretty much ended things at that point. But as you can imagine, after that whole fiasco of not only, you know, the king passing and the riots, but then, you know, you look in your history books of what happened in the later 60s and into the 70s, it just all of a sudden divided this city, that all of a sudden people maybe got along together because everybody knew where your neighborhood was and this, that, and the other, and all of a sudden you started to see people separate.
Well, it seems interesting because, like you said, the late 60s were a very difficult time in America with Bobby Kennedy and the Democratic Convention in 68 and Kent State in 70 and the continuing war. But it does also seem to coincide with economic issues. It sort of all seems to culminate in, you know, the late 60s and 70s. Tell me a little bit about what Joliet, like, let's focus on the downtown, because that's your dad's dealership was in the downtown. You know, after the riots in the early 70s, were people afraid to come downtown? Was there a sense of
you know, that was part of it. The other thing you got to realize is up until let's say roughly about 70, what Chicago Street was, the street out here the Rialto's on, that was 5 lanes of traffic, all southbound, a one-way street, 5 lanes. And if you were in the downtown on Saturday morning, the streets were packed with automobiles. A light changed and maybe 3 cars got through the light because traffic was backed up at the next light. At the north end of the city, down where the county government is right now, the county government building was Sears, so, you know, major retail department store in the country. Right across the street from Sears, in what now is more county or governmental offices, was J.C. Penney, so another big one. Right over a block on the other side of the parking deck was Montgomery Ward's, another big retailer. So business was in the city. All the banks were in the city. This is before branch banking. So if you wanted to go to the bank, there was only one bank, the main bank. There were no branches or offices or ATMs or anything else that we have nowadays. So all of commerce and all of retail was predominantly in the city. And the only thing that you had to the west challenging the city was in the late 50s, the Hillcrest Shopping Center was built, which was the first mall type of, it was an outdoor mall fashioned much like Oakbrook was, built a few years after that, where you strolled from store to store, but you were in a pedestrian closed area and the cars parked around the perimeter of all this retail. That was the only other option for retail around here other than the small businesses that were scattered through the neighborhoods, etc. So everything happened downtown. Starting in the early 70s, Jefferson Square Mall was built. So it was the first mall that really challenged the downtown area, I could say, outside of what Hillcrest did. Jefferson Square Mall brought Montgomery Ward's out there, so they were the first one to leave the downtown. And then a Weebolt store, which is actually a parent of Carson's now, they opened up out there. And so all of a sudden there was a little bit of a challenge, and the first indoor mall that we're, you know, all familiar with now came into play. You go into 1980, announcement is made that Louis Joliet Mall is going to be built, and that's going to be one of these super malls, and that's going to take Sears out of the downtown, Penny's out of the downtown, bring in a Bergner's, which was a affiliate of Weebolt's, and then Marshall Field's, which we had no Fields in Joliet at all. So that was like sort of dying and going to heaven, because Fields was primarily downtown Chicago, you thought of it, other than what was out in Oak Brook. So that all of a sudden starts to send commerce all over. Plus you see the early 80s, the advent of branch banking. And the original guidelines said the bank could only be so many miles, the branch so many miles away from the home or the main bank. So all these bankers, sort of as the crow flies, let's get our tape measure out, where can we build? So right across the street here, BMO Harris, which then was First National Bank, one of the oldest banks in the community, you can see that Essington Road, which is where they built their branch at Essington and Black, that was as far west as they could go, but they started to stretch it. Well, all of a sudden, there's less and less of a need to come into the downtown because retail is moving out by people, banking is moving out by people, so the only thing you have left within the city is governmental offices, financial institution bases, they kept their main banks down here, and then legal that work with the courts and government, etc. So that really starts the decay of the downtown. The city's first move was, just as Chicago did as well, let's close Chicago Street and let's make this a big outdoor mall. So they took all the traffic off, cemented everything over, planters, pots, trees, all those nice things.
This is what, maybe the early 80s?
This is the early 80s.
To compete with Louis Joliet.
Right, pedestrian walkway, etc. But of course, who would be walking down here, because there isn't a lot of retail left. They don't need to come down here to go and do their banking, etc., because we're getting branch banking out around the city, etc. And so it ended up being a major failure, like many communities saw. At the same time, the decks were built, because if we take parking and whatever off of this main street, where will all these people park? So we build the 2 parking decks that we have in the city to accommodate folks coming down here to shop. But they sort of didn't think about what were they going to come down here and what were they going to shop for. And so that, along with the economy and other things, you really start to see Joliet fall into decline in the early 80s.
So what's your sense of the real low point for Joliet? What did it feel like to live here? I mean, you had a job. You were at USF already, or CSF already. But in terms of, it must have been sad.
It was, and in fact, you talk a little bit about Frank Turk Sr. What the city did in around about 1980 is they asked businesses and major employers to band together and let's form a Center for Economic Development. And so the first woman that we brought in literally worked just for the city. And what they did is they went to businesses, and based on the size and the value of your organization in terms of operating income, etc., they sort of threw out a number as, we'd like you to contribute so much to this effort. The then College of St. Francis invested in that as well. We will invest to try to help the city recover, because we recognize if we can't turn things around, we're going to be operating a higher ed institution in an area that maybe nobody really wants to come, or that ends up being a victim of economic blight. They worked with that for a number of years, and then one that you want to talk with is John Grueling. John Grueling was eventually identified, and they said, let's bring this guy in. John, previous to coming to Joliet and working for the eventually expanded Will County Center for Economic Development, John had been integral to the development of Denver, and is it Hartsfield Airport out there? That's the big airport they built west of Denver. But anyway, John worked on that with the airlines, with the city of Denver and whatever.
And this is not a Joliet resident.
No, John had nothing to do with, didn't know anything about Joliet, but the city fathers found him, courted him, and attracted him in and said, can you help us come up with a real visionary plan to try to turn this place around? And what the Mrs. Fitzgerald did prior, when she was working on it from a Joliet perspective, is obviously she's trying to bring in retail, jobs, manufacturing, anything that she can find somebody interested in doing here. But they really had not come up with, and what John did was was he sold the city on warehousing and transportation. That, you know, we could build an intermodal center here that because of the access to the rivers, the rails, the interstates, businesses could bring their warehousing here, and this could become a warehousing hub for the center part of the country. Hadn't even had on his radar yet what eventually developed down at the Intermodal Center in Elwood, which came a little bit later in that whole thing. So that was sort of his plan on how we were going to do this. The other thing, sort of history fast check, 1990 was the Plainfield tornado. As of that point in time, Plainfield High School was still 600 students, a one building, one high school district, which was basically farmland all around it. And it was after that tornado, about 2 years later in '92, that we start to see the housing boom to the west of Joliet that led Joliet annexing to the west, to the point that the joke was the eastern boundary of Joliet is New Lenox, the western boundary is the state of Iowa, because we just started going west-west. Literally, Joliet left the county and went into Kendall County and kept annexing land. And John's plan of the intermodal, I don't think, was the pivotal point in turning the city around. It was the riverboats, because Joliet was the first to get its request in for a license, and then the Empress, it was called, which is now Hollywood Casino. The Empress was the first one to open. So that opened in roughly, I want to say maybe about 88, 89, somewhere in the late 80s. But we had the first boat in the water, followed closely by Harrah's with their boat in the downtown here. Joliet literally had to annex land to get to where Hollywood Casino is right now. That was not city of Joliet at all. And then Joliet did all of the infrastructure and anything else that was needed to get that going. But in those early 80s and or 90s and throughout much of the 90s, Joliet made so much money off of their revenue share from those boats that it got to the point they didn't know what to do with the money, and they were giving money to the schools based on, and even the university got it, based on the number of our students that has Joliet as an address. The city gave a stipend per head to be used for technology, and the equipment was owned by the city for a period of 5 years, and then at the end of 5 years you could buy the equipment from the city, and the city usually sold it for $1, because what's a 5-year-old computer worth back in the 90s? Not much. But anyway, that really started the redevelopment, because then what the city did with all of that money, and Nancy Schultz-Wutzel talk a little bit about her father's tenure during that late 80s and the 90s as mayor. They had so much money, let's go back now, and first of all, the annexation of the West, most of the communities in Illinois were still suffering. Joliet had money. You want water and sewer to build a subdivision? We'll bring it to you. So developers were just flocking here because land was cheap. We weren't in Chicago, so real estate was cheap to come by in terms of building something. The city had money to put in the infrastructure. We'll bring you water, sewer. We can provide you with police and fire protection, etc. And then the city will annex. So they just kept, as I said, moving to the west. And you look at one point, I remember in the middle or later 90s, you looked at the top growing cities in the country, and in the top 25 was Joliet. And if you looked at the other 24, they were all primarily either in the Southwest or in Florida. And then you have this town in Illinois? What's going on at this town in Illinois? But it was all driven by the city had money, so they could invest and bring people in and cause things to happen.
Chuck, you seem to be saying that the reason we're not Gary, Indiana, or Detroit,
or Decatur, Illinois. Decatur, Illinois.
Well, I mean, our industry, like Akron, or Gary, or Detroit, was sort of really based on manufacturing.
Right.
And then the manufacturing jobs went away.
Right.
70s?
Starting in the 70s and then escalating in the 80s, along with economic. You know, the 80s, what we're seeing going on right now, and well, certainly in the state of Illinois, we probably haven't really had anybody call it at the national level yet, but we had financial problems in the country. You know, Reagan comes into office in the 80s, the federal budget is all out of sync, and so, you know, what does any manager do but I got to cut? I don't have the money coming in to pay for all the things that I have to spend it on. So he's cutting left and right. That's trickling down to the states, to the cities, etc. The university had a criminal justice program that we started in the late 70s because there was lots of federal money. We want police to have a college education. So we started a program in cooperation with JJC, and we saw the numbers start to increase nicely. All of a sudden, the Reagan effect of federal budget cuts comes in, and along about 82, no more money for any of that stuff. We don't have any funds. So what happens to all these police that were expecting to get reimbursement through their states or cities? There's no money for you anymore. Enrollment tanks, and we let the program go.
So in the mid-'80s, what did downtown Joliet feel like? Did it feel like a bit of a ghost town?
It did, because, as I said, they had created this mall-like atmosphere on Chicago Street, which really didn't have any mall-like foot traffic on it. You were seeing more and more stores or establishments closed. There wasn't anything going on in there, so it's a glass window and nothing behind it, or the window's papered up. And then, you know, as you said earlier, people both not having a need to come down or feeling insecure about coming to the downtown because of some of the dynamics. And so, you know, I'll stay on the peripheral of the city, so whether it's I'll go into New Lenox or someplace east to shop, or I'll go into the far west side of Joliet to do shopping. That's what people did.
So is the moral of the story, get a casino?
Well,
really
as bad as I would have to say building an economy on gambling, I would say that's a bad strategy. It worked. It worked. It was a quick influx of cash. It did exactly what the state had hoped, which was these towns that were usually, they all had to be river-based, and if you were near a river, you usually had manufacturing, because access to water to cool or fuel whatever you were doing, access to water to theoretically transport goods back and forth. All of these cities that had rivers could apply for these gaming licenses, and the idea was from the state, we'll help you guys out locally, and we hope it'll help the state out as well.
Since Joliet did it and not everybody did this, was this something that was there a fight to get it? Like, was there a fight in the city about whether we should do this, or was just everybody?
No, the city had no fight at all about it.
Everybody was like,
and I mean, you could probably liken it to a person who's been out of work for a while, and knows they've got rent coming due on their house, know they have to put food on the table, and you could be a moral person up until that point, but you finally get to a point that you say, maybe I have to bend a little bit on my morals. And so ironically, there wasn't a big outcry from the religious leaders in the community that, you know, we should not turn to gaming or whatever. And how it was sold on to the city, and they were probably pretty right on this. We don't expect our residents to use those boats at all, but if people want to come here and spend money, we'll take it. So, and it was heavily, people came over from Indiana, people came over from Iowa or from downstate, people came out of the city. It was the only game in town unless you wanted to go to Las Vegas, where you could sit down at a table and play blackjack, pull slot machines, whatever it was. And the irony was, you think of Las Vegas with the entertainment, we never had entertainment in Joliet. The entertainment was, you can gamble. So
But I see those banners, don't they say like,
Well, now we have entertainment at some of these places, but that's because they're not coming just to gamble anymore, or they need more.
what's your sense of like the 90s or the downtown in the last decade or two? Like things do seem to be, I mean, I've lived in Joliet
Yeah.
since 95, and I've heard
Yeah.
for the 20 years that I've lived here, well, Joliet downtown, any day now.
Right.
It has improved.
Well, I would say they've stabilized the downtown. What we haven't come up with is a plan that works, and not that they haven't had lots of plans, but a plan that works to bring things back into the city. And so the latest iteration you hear is, we see that there is some success with restaurants. The baseball field was built as another attractor to bring people into the downtown. It has had some success. The Rialto has had success. But we don't seem to have the whole formula together yet, which the latest thing that's thrown into the mix is maybe we need to bring in millennial housing, that the 20-something, 30-somethings that are still starting a career and haven't gotten into a family and wanting the backyard, the swing sets and all that stuff, would like urban living with more of an urban nightlife, and maybe we could create some ambiance like that in the city to complement, because people aren't going to bring businesses down here. All of you, if you had to start a business, you're not necessarily going to say, I'm going to start it in Joliet, when you know that, from your experiences, lots of foot traffic during the day. I was downtown last night here for a group at 6:30, and when I walked out at 8 o'clock, it was a ghost town on Chicago Street. There was nothing going on at the Rialto. There were some lights over in Art and Design on the 3rd floor, so whether they just left those lights on or we had students over there, I don't know, but there wasn't a lot going on around here. So it's not the place that you're going to bring lots of foot traffic if that's what you want.
Okay, what I want to do